Hello, I'm Bill Browne, Director of the Democracy and Accountability Program at the Australia Institute, and welcome to today's webinar, Securing Fairness and Integrity in Australian Elections with Kate Chaney MP. To start off, I would like to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. The Australia Institute runs these webinars regularly, but the times vary. So the best way to find out about them is to register at australiainstitute.org.au/webinars. And in terms of making the Zoom webinar work well, you can type in questions for Kate using the Q&A box, and you can upvote other people's questions as well. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll boot you out. Finally, this is a live event and it is being recorded. The video will be available on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. Before we start, the Australia Institute is excited to be hosting Jose Ramos Horta, President of Timor-Leste and Nobel Peace Laureate, as our guest in October as part of the Australia Institute's 30th anniversary celebrations. President Ramos Horta will be speaking at the Sydney Opera House on Tuesday, 8th of October at 6 p.m, 25 years on from Timor-Leste's historic vote for independence. Tickets are on sale now, and for more details, visit our website, which is australiainstitute.org.au. The influence of money on politics corrodes Australia's democracy, overwhelmingly benefiting large corporations and wealthy individuals. But existing reform proposals like public funding, donation caps, and spending caps have not only failed to rein in the influence of big money, but actually concentrated political and financial power further. Australia needs an electoral system with a level playing field for all candidates, transparency so we know who is funding political actors, truth in political advertising, and limits on the financial power of vested interests. How can we balance these competing goals while preserving freedom of political communication and robust elections? Joining us today to help answer these questions is Kate Chaney, the federal member for Curtin. In 2022, Kate became the first woman from Western Australia to be elected as an independent federal MP. Kate's work in Parliament has included 2 private members' bills about electoral reform designed to rebuild trust in our political system. Kate, thank you for being here.
It's an absolute pleasure, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Now, Kate, you won Curtin in 2022, your first time running as a candidate. What did you find most surprising, in good or bad ways, about how elections function in Australia?
Well, I was really new to politics, and so I made some assumptions that turned out not to be true. One of those, for example, was I just assumed that you would be able to find out where donations came from before you vote. So in the first week, we built a website, we had a donor wall, and every donation was made public in real time. And that seemed to me like the minimum voters should be able to expect. And so it's a real surprise to me to find out that you don't actually find out who funds the political candidates until 10 months or many, many months after the election, depending on when the election is. And even then, only above $15,000. So that was a surprise. I mean, one of the other things that was I guess not a surprise to me, but it was very daunting looking at running as an independent and being up against these massive party machines. So, we didn't have any infrastructure. So we needed an office. We needed some people who were able to, commit 24 hours a day to the campaign. We needed a photocopier. We needed phones. We needed everything from scratch. Which as opposed to the major parties that have all that infrastructure in place. So it really is a bit of an uphill battle.
And you're a member of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, which was tasked with reviewing Australia's elections. And the committee over the last couple of years considered truth in political advertising, donation transparency, and spending and donation caps. Where did the committee land with its final reports, and how does that accord with your thinking?
Well, so we did an inquiry, and I joined the committee about halfway through that inquiry. There hadn't ever been an independent on that committee before. So just think about that for a moment. The committee that does the reviews of the elections and how they're run and what needs to change has until now been entirely formed of the major parties. So I definitely, brought something new to that. There was a Greens person on that committee as well from the Senate. We heard that evidence, we put together a report, and then I did additional comments to that report. In the majority report, it did talk about the need for improvements on transparency and truth, and also caps. But I felt like there were all these other recommendations that had come through from think tanks and academics and civil society organisations that were not reflected in the majority report. So I put them into additional comments, which then I ended up turning into a private members bill, because it felt like there were all these reforms that were good for communities and good for voters, but not necessarily in the interests of the major parties. And they'd just been overlooked, again and again.
One thing that struck me
We seem to have frozen. I don't know if it's me or everyone.
Sorry, everyone. I seem to be having some computer problems. Hopefully they've been resolved. But one thing that struck me about the Joint Standing Committee process was the release of an interim report, which had a lot of the electoral law changes that we'll be discussing today, but also that have been contemplated by the Albanese government. An idea there that it could accelerate the work of changing electoral laws in Australia, perhaps in time for the upcoming election due sometime next year. I was wondering if you could update us on the process, where the Albanese government is up to and what we're expecting to see.
Yeah, so as you say, a lot of the electoral reform recommendations came out in the interim report, which is now literally years ago that was put out, and governments are meant to respond within 6 months. We haven't seen any action on that at all so far. And the Special Minister for State, Don Farrell, has been consulting on that. And I've had a series of meetings about that, but I'm yet to see any legislation. The reality is we're now probably so close to the next election that I expect that will be used as an excuse for why we can't put in place transparency before the next election, which I think is very disappointing, given that it was Labor policy before the last election, and I think even the election before that, to reduce the threshold for disclosure to $1,000 from about $15,000, and also make it closer to real time, so that instead of waiting 10 months after the election, you find out within days or a week or some realistic time frame who your political candidates are getting their funding from. So we have had some discussions. In order to really prompt that, I put together 2 private members' bills that had broad support from the crossbench in both houses and think tanks like the Australia Institute and others, with about 10 to 12 different reforms that have broad support, as a bit of a baseline to say to the government, if you're doing something other than this, this is what it should be compared to. Because the big concern is that the major parties get together and do a deal and embed the status quo. And we don't let Coles and Woolies make the laws about supermarket competition, but we let Liberal and Labor make the laws about political competition. And so that's the big concern, is that we see a reform package that actually has the effect of reducing political competition.
One of the things that the Australia Institute has done a fair bit of work on is outlining principles for fair political finance reform, with an eye to precisely this, of protecting our political system against changes that might be unfair in either direction. The 9 principles break down kind of a lot into two main categories, which is keeping a level playing field and fair and contested elections, and making sure that changes are proportional and targeted, that they're likely to be effective at addressing the problems. Within those kind of broad categories, we see a need to ensure that new entrants are able to compete with incumbents, and that party candidates and independent candidates are treated fairly, that we balance those different starting points and different needs in the changes that we make. I wanted to pick up too on this idea that we might be able to carve up the government's objectives and achieve some of them before the next election, even if others might have to wait for more prolonged review. And it strikes me that the transparency system could be a good example of something. Does that seem right to you?
Absolutely. I mean, I built a website in a week that made our donations fully disclosed. It really isn't that hard, and we'll hear lots of arguments about how administratively it's too difficult. But I think we should be able to do that. And one of the real challenges I found when I did my additional comments and thought, let's turn this into a private members bill, I could see that there's too much money in politics and people don't like that. And so I thought, right, I'll come up with a model and get consult broadly and come up with a model that's fair. And it is really, really hard to work out how to cap spending in a way that doesn't make it an uneven playing field. And that's because of all these incumbent advantages and party advantages. So if you say each candidate can actually spend the same amount of money, then that per seat, then the major parties can pay for their national TV advertising, for example, out of unwinnable seats. So then they've got more money to spend against a challenger in a particular seat that's being contested. Also, they've got all that infrastructure in place, an office, a team, a comms budget if they're the incumbent. I now have a comms budget because I'm an incumbent. And so it's very hard, excuse me, to come up with a model that actually has a level playing field. And so what I'm very concerned about is that we see a reform package that sounds good, but embeds the majors. For example, by replacing donations with public funding, which sounds great in principle, but what it means effectively is that the major parties pick up the public funding from their last election and can use that going forward. And any new challenger has to start from scratch and doesn't have that public funding.
We see that kind of trend in public funding, particularly at the state level, where they've implemented in some states per member of parliament public funding on top of the per vote public funding. Now, as you say, even the per vote public funding is only available to people who've already contested an election. New entrants can't get it until after the election has passed. But that's exacerbated when you introduce per MP public funding, which really does reward the winners at the expense of people who may be growing in support, contesting at a future election, or have not yet mobilised to run for election.
And you can see that if, with the declining support for the major parties over the last generation, you can understand why the parties would want to arrest that trend and put something in place that really protects their dominance. But the reality is 99.6% of Australians are not a member of a major political party, yet the way we structure elections really favours candidates who come out of that party system. So I think there's a really big community interest in making sure that we have a level playing field. And it's very hard to work out how to do caps in a way that reflects the fact that people don't want individuals to come and take over elections. We don't want to see Clive Palmer's or others have undue influence, but at the same time make sure that new starters do have half a chance.
One of the concerns I've had about a lot of the kind of electoral reform debate is that it's sometimes focused on principles at the expense of worked examples of how the laws might change things in practice. And to give a few examples for listeners who might want to kind of play around with these ideas themselves, if you impose a spending cap on third parties, does that mean that a union with 10,000 members and a union with 50,000 members are limited to spending the same amount? And is that the same amount as a corporation with one shareholder or 100,000 shareholders? There may be answers to these questions, but they can be much trickier than the kind of blanket idea that we just need spending caps and that'll solve our problems. To give another example, if you cap spending per candidate, but the coalition can run two candidates in a seat, one for the Nationals, one for the Liberals, can they in effect outspend the Liberal candidate 2-1 on issues that may be similar, supporting a government or opposition that is shared between them? Things start to get really complicated. Kate, I wanted to spend a bit more time on these private members' bills. And firstly, for people in the chat who might not be familiar with kind of how Parliament works, what is a private members' bill and what role does it play?
Yeah, so this was a bit of a surprise to me when I started in the role, how private members' bills work, because actually they don't get debated in Parliament. You have the opportunity to get legislation drafted and introduce it into the Parliament, but then it's up to government whether or not they bring it on for debate, and they almost never do. But it does have the impact of saying, here is a way we could deal with this issue. Here is a sample law. And so then any future ways of dealing with it in other bits of legislation that the government introduces can be compared against that. So I introduced a restoring trust bill late last year, and then a fair and transparent elections bill in February this year that was introduced in both houses simultaneously. David Pocock did it at the same time. And those bills really had three areas: improving transparency, reducing financial influence, and levelling the playing field. And so they dealt with things like lowering the disclosure to $1,000, disclosing within 5 days, fixing the definition of gift so that it included things like expensive dinners and memberships and subscriptions. Sorry, that's my light going off. Requiring disclosure of fundraising events and other things instead of them being all bucketed into other receipts. Addressing truth in political advertising. We don't allow lies being told in trade and commerce, but we do in politics, which seems weird. On reducing financial influence, it involved banning donations from social harm industries like gambling. And we're seeing right now a failure to really address online gambling advertising, possibly linked to the $1.7 million that the gambling companies donated to the major parties in the last year. It also banned donations from government contractors. The second bill included a cap, which was a donation cap that said no individual can donate more than 2% of the total public funding from the last election. So linking it to say that no one should have more than 2% influence. And then on evening the playing field, things like the way governments can use their own budgets to put up ads before an election. If you look at the ad spend for governments, there's a big spike before each election paid for by taxpayers. So limiting that, stopping the postal voting process from being used to harvest data from people, making privacy and spam laws apply to political parties, and a few other technicalities. So that's what those covered. And they were all the bits that came out of the recommendations or the evidence in those hearings that I heard that the parties just chose to ignore because it didn't suit their position.
And you mentioned Senator David Pocock kind of jointly introduced that bill in the Senate. What's the kind of nature of support? Is it broadly supported across the crossbench? Have there been any moves from either of the major parties?
Well, so I would say it has both those, or certainly the second bill had the broad support of both houses. They both did really, and the Greens are pretty supportive of that too. The major parties have shown very little interest in it. And you might have seen some comments in the media from Don Farrell in the last 24 hours. We're expecting to see a reform package before the end of the year, apparently. And I think we just need to make sure that goes through the appropriate review process and is subject to public scrutiny as well as by all members of Parliament. What I would hate to see is something introduced and passed without it being appropriately considered, because the devil is really in the detail, especially when it comes to caps. And I mean, I haven't seen the detail of what Minister Farrell is proposing, and I'm open to it. I think if they can come up with a cap system that is actually fair, I'm all for it. I just haven't seen one yet that I think is fair. So potentially, and I can see there's a question there from Claire saying why the Teal Independents think that this will disadvantage candidates like me. The reality is we now have incumbency advantage, so we have some of the benefits, but we're more concerned about new challenges and how it could disadvantage people who are starting from scratch. If you say both can spend X dollars, the incumbent and a new challenger, the new challenger has all these extra costs that mean effectively they have a whole lot less money to actually spend getting their name and their message out there, and they don't have the benefit of already being there. So I haven't seen the detail yet, but I think there are some real concerns, and we really need to be holding government and the opposition to account to make sure that they are not embedding a duopoly.
Australia Institute polling research finds that the vast majority of Australians want truth in political advertising laws. And when we frame it as whether those laws should come before the next election, there's almost the same level of support as for truth in political advertising laws in principle. And it seems to me if part of the problem with electoral reform is that we don't necessarily know exactly how political finance works and who's spending money and where, would there be a case for perhaps splitting the government's bill and getting some of the more established elements of it passed earlier and then spending time on other aspects?
I think transparency and truth are the highest priority, and that's where there is the broadest support. Certainly on transparency, it's government policy, or it's ALP policy apparently, and has been for a couple of elections. So we'd like to actually see it implemented. And in some ways, and there's another question there, that on-time disclosure being more important than restrictions. If there's full transparency, people can also make their own decisions about how they feel about those candidates accepting money from those people. So it does take a bit of the sting out of the caps if you can see it. Now, if you were looking at voting for a candidate who'd had $1,000 donated by 10,000 different people, surely that's democracy working. So I think transparency definitely is a priority. In terms of truth, we face huge threats to our democracy with misinformation and disinformation, and requiring truth in political advertising, or banning lies in political advertising, won't entirely address that, but it is the bare minimum. And that there's been in South Australia, they've had an equivalent provision for 25 years. The sky hasn't fallen in. The Electoral Commission is still trusted. But it does actually make political candidates think twice before making a claim that can be proven to be false. So it can't be about opinion, obviously, or for predictions for the future, but statements that can be proven to not be true are then banned. And it's really the minimum that we should be doing. And it's pretty urgent given what we're seeing in democracies globally with misinformation and disinformation.
And people listening into the webinar might be wondering kind of why I distinguish truth as political advertising as something that could happen soon. And it's precisely because, as Kate says, we have a working model that exists in South Australia. Since they introduced a kind of model in the 1990s where complaints go to the Electoral Commissioner. they're often processed in a matter of days, because, of course, one of the big concerns of truth in political advertising laws is that in the heat of an election campaign, how do you get redress before the horse has bolted, the damage has been done? But the proof is that these systems can work and can work relatively quickly. Another element that I think is particularly important for truth in political advertising laws is that they have been tested in the courts. And one of the issues that arises with changes to electoral laws is potentially running into the implied freedom of political communication, which the courts have found in our constitution. It's something that's likely to limit the government's ambitions in other aspects of electoral reform as well. But for truth in political advertising laws, the South Australian Supreme Court has considered them and found them to be proportionate. And a big part of that is because the laws are structured quite cleverly to be well measured, I would say. The main form of redress is just that you have to withdraw the misleading advertising and issue a correction, which seems pretty inoffensive in almost any cases, even if it's an inadvertent case of misleading advertising. The least you could be expected to do is to pull the ads and explain how you got things wrong.
And I think that, some will say that doesn't go far enough and it should go further. It's not going to be perfect, and there will always be disagreements about whether it goes far enough or too far. But the fact is, at the moment, there's nothing. So even a conservative framework that only addresses the most egregious cases at least makes political candidates think about whether what they're saying is factually inaccurate. And so, we're working off a very low base here. And I think before the next election, we should at least have something in place that we can continue to improve on. But just saying it's all too hard to do doesn't seem acceptable to me when it is such an important thing that we're talking about.
There's an extract in Pamela Williams' book, The Victory, about the 1996 election, which has this real sliding doors moment. There was an element of private regulation of free-to-air TV fact-checking ads at the time. And their decision about whether an ad would or would not run, I think, profoundly shaped the narratives at play in the 1996 election. And I think we see in South Australia too the capacity to nip misleading ad campaigns in the bud. It's not perfect, but as you say, it goes a long way to improving civility and to giving power to the voices inside a party room who might be arguing for a more kind of accurate and complete approach.
Absolutely. Can I address some of the questions in the Q&A?
Yeah, go for it.
So Raquel, is there a space for mass media to report and keep an open tally of investment? Well, the media can only report what's publicly available. So certainly because I was disclosing all my donations in real time, in the 2022 campaign, there were numerous stories about who donated to my campaign and what that meant for me. But it was just compared to no information for my opponent. So voluntary disclosure, which I'm doing again now, means you get the scrutiny, and if it's not a level playing field, it doesn't work. So there needs to be some requirement so that media can actually report on what's available. Robin said the 2% cap sounds good, but how do you stop families from donating collectively? We did put provisions in place to capture that. It's potentially imperfect, but actually at the moment, with all the different entities that exist within, for example, the coalition and a $15,000 cap, you could actually donate more than $1 million to the coalition and it not be disclosed at all because you've split it up into $14,000 pieces. So, but there are ways to address that and tighten it up. Lukesh, South Australia's proposed donation reforms, they sound great, saying let's get the donations out of elections, but what we see is that it's replaced with public funding, and not through a per vote thing, but through an administration payment. And so really it just means it's great news for the major parties, but it will be very difficult for independents to get up and challenge the status quo there. And I think it has public appeal saying we're getting the money out of politics, but what it's actually saying is we're getting the money from donors or, you know, people who might want to support their candidates out, and we're replacing it with taxpayer money for those who are already embedded. So it's not quite what it says on the box.
And Lokesh, if you're interested in some of the Australia Institute's analysis, we've published our submission to the South Australian government's consultation on those proposed changes. And yeah, we find serious concerns. It introduces a large amount of public funding, the vast majority of which goes to the major parties, with only about 1% for new entrants. And meanwhile, it constrains the ability of new entrants to fundraise. In practice, what that means is you're going to see fully funded major party candidates and MPs running against new entrants who are extremely limited in how much money they can raise, unless they're privately wealthy. And I should note that because while there are limits on receiving donations from others, those that have their own monetary reserves can contribute to their own campaign, not subject to the cap, or subject to a much larger cap. And so that's something that I think really needs looking out for. If our aim is to increase trust in democracy, have we designed the changes to the laws so that they avoid perverse outcomes?
I might answer a question from Heather there about Don Farrell's comments about the Westminster system of government is based on two political parties. And this is definitely a narrative that I've heard from the minister. And it really suits the incumbents to really only have one opponent to deal with. I think we are really lucky in Australia. We have compulsory voting and preferential voting, which means that there is a moderating impact, and it is possible for candidates to get up at the moment until that's changed by the major parties. But so I think what we're seeing with the declining support for major parties over the last generation is that there is a sense that there are different ways possible, and you don't always have to choose between red and blue. There are more creative and different ways of approaching issues, and every issue doesn't come down to a binary, one-dimensional choice. And so what I think is really important is that we have an electoral system that allows our parties and our system and our representatives to evolve and change over time and adapt to new circumstances and how people are thinking and wanting to be represented. And that's exactly why I've focused on this, because it seems to underpin every other issue we need to deal with, is making sure the right people, the best people are in the room, making the decisions for the right reasons. And that's what the electoral system dictates.
And Kate, do you think that the kind of rising minor party and independent vote will already has changed how the major parties operate? Do they kind of adapt in response to the new competition?
I mean, I think it has had an impact, and part of that impact is that, party discipline sounds great on paper. It certainly makes things simpler, but it does mean that you're not necessarily, as a representative, representing your community, because the party interests have to come ahead of the community interests. And I think on issues like gambling reform, there are people on both sides of Parliament who are quietly saying to the crossbenchers, keep going on this, keep pushing hard. They can't speak out publicly. And I think seeing independents who can speak out publicly and raise issues and keep things on the agenda means that backbenchers are starting to think, well, hang on, I want to be able to speak up about what my community wants too. So I think it does create some disruption in a way that that benefits democracy and the fundamental principle of representative democracy in the long term. And we are starting to see a bit of that from both sides.
Because the Senate has been out of the hands of the government for most of its history since proportional representation was introduced, there's a sense that crossbenchers can have an outsized influence. But there's been an interesting idea emerging, even from some former major party senators, that a lot of the power of the crossbench would be reduced if backbenchers were prepared to cross the floor on different issues. You'd be increasing the options for the government to form a kind of coalition of votes. So I wonder if we'll see more of that happening, as well as these kind of smaller level revolts where people might speak out but not vote differently.
And I did an event with A.C. Grayling, a British author and philosopher who's written a couple of books about democracy last week. And one of the 5 things that he thinks needs to change is that party discipline, because you end up with a sclerotic, version of democracy where you only have 2 options to choose from. If people could actually move and government had to actually build a coalition of communities that support an idea before reform's possible, then we would get better outcomes that serve a larger proportion of the population. And so that's one of the things that I think would be a positive development, and one of the things having more voices in Parliament has contributed to.
We have a question here from Kate Crawford. Would it be better to make active membership of a campaign, for example, 500 signatures nominees, necessary for spending earned in an election?
I think that's great, but I think it's an and, not an or. So what we saw in the last election was Clive Palmer put in more than $100 million. Money alone doesn't actually work. You need community support and you need money. And I had nearly 1,000 volunteers involved. Some of the other teals had more than that. And I think it's that combination of volunteers plus the funding to get the message out, or the donations or funding somehow to get the message out is needed. So by all means, that's a good way to create a threshold. But one of my concerns by saying, there's a fund here and new candidates can tap into it if they meet some criteria, is it's unlikely to actually be big enough to address that imbalance. So it might be a token effort, but you've got to look at the real value of that incumbent advantage, and it would have to be pretty substantial.
The 2022 election was, among other things, the integrity election. An Australia Institute polling research found 6 times as many people said that integrity was more important to them at that election than said it was less important to them than the election prior. Do you have a sense yet of what themes are emerging for the upcoming federal election?
Yeah, it is a different environment, and I think that cost of living, economic management, climate still is very important in my electorate. But the thing about integrity is that it underpins all of those issues. And so if we don't have a flourishing, evolved political system and electoral an election system, then we're not going to be able to address any of those big long-term issues. And so that's why I think this is worth focusing on, even though it can be seen as being a little bit of an in the tent Canberra type issue, but it fundamentally underpins all the major issues. So, I think it's still, when people turn their minds to it and realise what an impact it's having on everything else, it does make the list.
You only need to look at climate change or national security, robo-debt, to see this integrity problem at the heart of so many other kind of cascading issues.
That's right. And even on something like housing, we have a huge problem with housing affordability in this country at the moment. That's been built by government policy on both sides over the last 20 years, because people love it when the value of their house goes up on paper, and 2/3 of households are owned. So because the parties are so focused on winning the next election and putting that party priority over the long-term future of the country, we end up with policies that drive house prices up. And so you wouldn't necessarily connect housing with the 2-party system. But when we've got machines that are focused on winning elections and a system that really optimises for that contest the whole time, it's much harder to make progress on long-term issues.
We have a question here from Andrew Holliday. Democracy depends on an informed electorate, and being lied to makes that impossible. How can there be any non-sinister explanation for any politician of any party being opposed to this?
And I think the answer to that is it's the George Orwell argument, which is who gets to determine what the truth is. And therefore, no one, each individual should be able to determine what they consider to be the truth, separately. We don't do that in trade and commerce. We do actually, ban misleading and deceptive conduct on the basis that everyone shouldn't have to go out and do their own research about whether when someone says my paint dries the fastest, whether you have to go and find out if it's true or not. We also have court systems. We have approaches to determining truth. Now, some of them might take a long time, but the prospect of there being some agreed sense of what the truth is, I think, a fundamental part of having a functioning society. And as soon as we say there's no such thing as truth, everyone makes up their own truth and no one can tell me what the truth is. And if they do, then they're part of a conspiracy. It undermines the fundamental institutions of our society. So that's why I don't buy the George Orwell argument.
And as you say, it's unfair because politicians have been happy to limit the ability of others to lie in other circumstances. Trade and commerce, as you say, defamation, perjury. But also, when I appear before a parliamentary committee, I have to swear an oath to tell the truth. And while in practice, Parliament doesn't use its powers to find people in contempt and actually kind of punish people, it reserves for itself the ability to do so. It can only have that power if there is a way to determine objective truth and a way to figure these things out. So, yeah, I agree absolutely.
Mike Knight said, oh no, it's just disappeared. Would the two-party domination, hang on, will the option for party members to vote as desired reduce polarisation in society as well as more moderate decisions? I think so. I think that once backbenchers are actually freed to vote the way they think that their community wants them to, it completely changes how you develop policy and has a moderating effect and a more creative effect. If you think about two people having an argument, as soon as you bring a third perspective in that, it changes it. It's not yes, no, black, white. You start to have more creative solutions being put on the table. So I think it has great potential to improve the quality of the outcomes that we're delivering.
The committee system seems like it's a bit less subject to the kind of strict party line than voting in Parliament. Has your experience with your various committee work been that there is more of a chance for collaboration there?
Yeah, I mean, the gambling inquiry is a really good example where I sit on the Social Policy and Legal Affairs Committee, and we had more than 40 hours of oral evidence and hundreds of submissions, and we came up with a unanimous set of recommendations, 31 recommendations about reforming online gambling so that it's managed better nationally, regulated, banning gambling ads, etc. No dissenting opinions at all from all across the political spectrum. But then once it gets into party world, the major parties don't want to annoy the broadcast media in an election year, and they probably don't want to upset the millions of dollars in political donations that come from the gambling sector. And suddenly you see a real watering down of those recommendations. So I think the committee system is a good example. Some committees that I've sat on, it is more partisan, but it has the potential when people are actually sitting and listening to evidence and asking questions, then you're more likely to find some common ground than when you're standing in Parliament shouting at each other.
Thank you, Kate. I wanted to come back to kind of the 47th Parliament, which is nearing its end. And as a kind of first-term MP, what are your reflections on how Parliament works or maybe from time to time doesn't work?
Yes, I think we, and I've had people from both sides say it's been better since you guys have been here with the expanded crossbench. And we are we sometimes get called prefect's corner. We do like to actually play by the rules and be civil. I was a bit shocked when I saw question time the first time being in it, at the poor quality of the debate, and the fact that this was the side of Parliament that the public saw. And so I've been working with the crossbench to try to improve the quality of that, with some success, and there are still things that really need to change. I think that having a larger crossbench has changed the sorts of questions that are asked. There is more debate about legislation. There are more improvements to legislation. Amendments, the government actually considers amendments from the crossbench and sometimes agrees with them, either directly or behind the scenes in making their own amendments. So I think that we've been able to contribute to improving incrementally the legislation that's there, as well as keeping some issues on the agenda, so that they don't just get disappeared by the major parties whose interests are not aligned with them. So definitely some improvements. I would say the quality of the debate maybe has gone off a bit in the last year, and we are seeing more of that polarised debate on issues like immigration and Gaza, and there are some things that have really come down to some pretty ugly point scoring. But I'm still very optimistic, and I think that in a balanced Parliament, you're more likely to see a focus on the long term and an ability to make change with a broader support across the community, than it just being one side's turn, the other side sits back and throws rocks for 3 years, then they have their turn. We're treating the Parliament as a separate branch of government, and it's about improving the quality of laws. So that's been quite positive to be part of.
I've noticed kind of when you start talking about changing how parliamentary processes work, the standing orders and so on, there's a risk that people's eyes glaze over. It feels very inside baseball. But I liked your kind of comparison with question time, that if that's what people are going to see and that's going to colour how they imagine Parliament works, then changes to parliamentary processes could be tremendously important for changing or improving trust in government. Do you have a kind of wish list that if you could change the way it works, these are the things you'd like to do?
I mean, I do, and still working on that. And that would be the sort of thing that I think would be up for discussion if there's a balanced Parliament. As you say, what happens in the House seems a bit boring and distant, but ultimately that's how we're making our laws. So I think making sure that we've got the processes right so that we're considering the interests of a broader group of people, and communities get to have a say, is really important. But things like, you look at question time, and no one has to answer a question, which I think is really weird. And, there's this sense that if you can avoid answering the question but still sort of sound smart, then you've succeeded in question time. But people can see through that. So I'd like to see, just as one small example, a requirement that says if a fact or figure is requested in question time and you can't provide it on the spot, then you provide it within 24 hours rather than just fudging it. And there are rules like that in other parliaments. There's no reason we couldn't do that. But there's a sense for the people who've been there for a long time, and it's the sport of it, that's all fun and games and what it's meant to be like. But generally, people look at it and say, they didn't answer the question.
One of the things I'd like to see is allowing for supplementary questions in question time, which is the case in the Senate. And a couple of years ago, we put out research, and the Labor opposition, as it was at the time, decided to put a question based on our research to the relevant minister in the House and the relevant minister in the Senate. And because the questions were so similar, you could see the effect that supplementary questions had, because in the House, the question was dodged and didn't amount to anything. And in the Senate, those follow-up questions occurred, and we actually got closer to the heart of the matter and got more detail. And so I think there's so much to be learned from how parliaments operate. You've flagged this idea of a balanced parliament, one in which, I assume you're thinking one in which the House of Representatives the balance of power is held by the crossbench. Did you have any more kind of reflections to share on the prospects of that and what might be involved in the days and weeks afterwards?
Look, not really. It's a way off yet. I guess I feel confident that I and probably some of the other newer arrivals in the parliament have come for the right reason, that we want to contribute to a better functioning system that delivers better long-term outcomes, and that's the principle that I'd take into any in any discussion. I don't want to cause chaos and uncertainty. I think that there is a real potential, though, to having a bunch of people in the crossbench who are not fighting for the right to be the boss, but are there for the long-term interests of the country, can actually deliver better outcomes than the swing from one side to the other. So I think in some ways it's the opposite of chaos. It actually provides a moderating impact, and I'll be contributing with that in mind. Might look at some other questions too, because there are lots that are coming in and I want to answer all of them, which is going to be impossible. Lokesh, your comment about increased participation of citizens beyond voting in elections like Taiwan. I think this is fascinating, and this is something that I've really worked on in my community, is how we have policy-based events and get input from people and feed it into our political processes. I'm actually doing a tech-based trial at a small scale based very much on Taiwan with young people to look at different ways that we can engage citizens and rebuild that sense of ownership of our democracy, rather than it being something you do once every 3 years. 4-year political parliamentary terms, I think that would be great, Annette. Unfortunately, to have 4-year set terms, it would require a referendum, and I think there's very little appetite for another referendum anytime soon. Can you pick out any that you like the look of there, Bill?
I guess there's a question there from Mark Johnston about parties being more and more focused on their base rather than kind of reaching out. And do you have reflections on that? And in particular, he's asked whether the only realistic solution is for independents to hold the balance of power.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's the only solution, because I do think having greater transparency about where those vested interests are creates a different set of incentives for the parties as well, in terms of who they take money from. So I think improving transparency could change the way parties just accept funding, and also have to actually justify their decisions based on who they've got links with. I mean, I don't think it's a bad thing for independents to hold the balance of power, although I also can see the argument that you don't want any one person to have too much power in a system. So loosening up the party discipline approach and having some people there who are purely there to improve the quality of the laws, rather than to wait for their turn to be part of the executive, I think has a stabilising impact, along with greater transparency generally.
And Kate mentioned earlier the very small percent of the population that are members of political parties. But to some extent, that's a recent phenomenon. Of course, it's never been the majority of the population, but party membership relative to population has been much higher in the past. And personally, I'd like to see more participation in our democracy across the board, and more people joining political parties, more people joining community groups, more people turning up to protests. And I think that's likely to lead to a richer, more robust democracy. We do identify advantages to political parties, as well as advantages to independents. Political parties can allow for the smooth transition of power. They can allow for two very clear policy platforms to be contrasted. Meanwhile, on the other hand, you have the advantages of independence that Kate has outlined. So a democracy where we're all paying more attention strikes me as something that'll be very valuable.
Absolutely, and I completely agree. I'm much more interested in people getting involved than who they get involved with. More voices has got to be a good thing, and democracy only works when people turn up. There are a couple of questions in there about two parties and oligopoly and comparisons to other oligopolies in Australia, and I think they're really valid points, and you can see how we naturally end up with two parties with market power in all sorts of different industries. But we often also put some guardrails up to prevent that. And, some will say we don't do enough and we need to do more to prevent oligopolies or reduce their power. The same thing happens in politics. The only difference is they're the ones making the laws. Whereas with every other industry, it's the politicians who end up making the laws about that industry. So I think there's a bit of a double danger there.
Well, thank you, Kate. I think that's a great note to end on. We will have to wrap it up there. Please, can everyone thank Kate Chaney MP, and thank you everyone for coming along and for your great questions. I think it was a really interesting and robust discussion about the opportunities and problems facing Australian democracy.
Can I just say, and thank you very much for having me, and thank you to everyone who's here, because you are engaging in our democracy, and we need more people like you. So much appreciated.
Well said. Thank you. And just a reminder to anyone in Sydney on the 8th of October about the address from President Jose Ramos Horta at the Sydney Opera House. Please get in fast to secure your tickets. You can find the details at australiainstitute.org.au. And don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube and to our podcasts Follow the Money, Dollars and Cents, and After America. Thank you again, Kate. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.